the midwife who couldn't even save her own child. The words cut through the red hollow apothecary like the slash of a sharp knife, splitting the air already thick with judgment. Clara Wynne clutched the slip of paper, her hand trembling, her eyes fixed on the wooden floor to hide the storm clawing up inside her. The loss of her husband, the loss of her child, the long nights with a soaked pillow were now laid bare before the sneers of the crowd. Each heartbeat weighed like lead, every breath caught like a snare. Then the door slammed open. A cold wind lashed in, scattering loose papers across the dim light. A cowboy stepped inside, tall, dust-covered from the road, his hand resting easy on the grip of his revolver, his shadowed gaze cutting straight to the man who had mocked her. One low, steady word dropped from his lips, and the room fell silent as stone. In that moment, among a crowd that had only ever scorned her, Clara saw, for the first time, someone stand on her side. But his arrival was only the toll of a bell at dawn, the warning that darkness still lurked beyond the door, waiting to swallow them both whole. Winter of 1879. The wind swept down the main street of Red Hollow, Wyoming, like lashes of a whip, cold enough to bite through bone. Snow had not yet fallen, but the frost had already sunk its teeth deep into the marrow. Thin films of ice clung to horse troughs, while dry dust still clung to porch roofs, lifting in small swirls with every gust, leaving the town both rugged in its frontier stance and merciless in its refusal of softness. Few souls walked abroad. Each bootstep, each iron wheel grinding over frozen earth, echoed sharp against the silence. The wooden door of Carter's General and Pharmacy creaked as Clara Wynne pushed it open. A draft of cold air followed her inside, curling around the room steeped in the scent of dried herbs and bitter tonics. Clara pulled her gray shawl tighter around her throat and walked toward the wooden shelves where glass jars stood in ordered rows. Her boots clicked softly on the floorboards, mingling with the faint clatter of a stopper being pressed onto a bottle behind the counter. Clara knew this place well. For years she had come to buy yarrow, pennyroyal, fennel seed, herbs she brewed into remedies. The work of a midwife never strayed far from such sharp, earthy smells. But today, what weighed upon her shoulders was not the wicker basket hanging from her arm, but the strange haze in the room, part curiosity, part contempt, that seemed to drift above every head. The first whisper rose from the right-hand corner, where two women in heavy skirts stood close together, their eyes sliding toward Clara. The first voice, loud enough for all to hear, chimed like a church bell rung for spite. "Do you know who just walked in? The midwife. The midwife without a child." The second woman gave a low hum, running her hand across a pouch of dried leaves as she spoke, pitched just high enough for Clara's ears. "A midwife who's never been a mother? That's a fine jest. If she'd ever known the pain of birthing, maybe she'd know more than scissors and bundles of weeds. Who could trust their baby to a woman who's never held one of her own?" The words were not meant as a private exchange. They were sharp points, driven to pierce. Clara lowered her gaze, pretending to read the paper list in her hand, though her fingers trembled against it. The letters blurred, not from poor light, but from memories summoned once again. She drew a breath, filling her chest with the bitter air of dried herbs, a sting as acrid as their mockery. Reaching for the jar of yarrow, she set it softly on the counter, careful not to betray her shaking. So many times it had been the same, her ears burning, her heart wrenched, yet her face a mask of silence. But the first woman was not finished. She raised her voice, deliberate as a hammer blow meant for all to hear. If this town had any sense, they'd keep their little ones well away from her hands. God help the poor babe laid in the arms of such an empty woman. For a taut moment, the room itself held still. The apothecary behind the counter froze in his work. The man seated by the fire lifted his head, a smirk playing at his lips. Only Clara stood unmoving, her eyes fixed on the rows of bottles, as if they were the only things free of judgment. Yet within her chest, every beat fell heavy as stone. She had heard such words for years. At first, they drew tears, silent weeping in her tiny rented room. Later, the tears dried, leaving only a bitter patience. No one cared why she had no child. It was enough that they had cause to sneer. In a town as small as Red Hollow, that was more than enough to forge a rumor into law. Memory pressed hard upon her. The winter nights years ago when fever had stolen both her husband and her newborn in a matter of weeks. The hollow it left behind had been bottomless, yet she had not let it swallow her whole. Instead, she rose to the work of midwifery, the same calling her grandmother had followed. If she could not keep her own child, perhaps she might help other mothers keep theirs. But to the people of Red Hollow, that resolve only sharpened the jest. The door to the shop banged open again. A gust of wind rushed in, scattering loose papers across the counter. A tall figure stepped inside, broad-shouldered, dust from the trail still clinging to his coat of worn leather, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing half his face. His boots struck the floor with a weight that carried warning. The air inside seemed to stiffen. Clara lifted her eyes just long enough to catch the glint of cold light in the newcomer's gaze. Ethan McCrae, a name every townsperson knew. A young rancher, widowed, living quiet with his small child out by the edge of the valley. He stopped beside Clara, saying nothing at first, his eyes locked instead upon the man by the fire, whose smirk had not yet faded. In that instant, silence spread thick as ice across the room. Clara heard the pounding of her own heart, steady against the shrill whistle of the wind outside. The wooden door had barely shut behind him, the scent of horsehide and trail dust still clinging to his coat, when the pharmacy fell into a taut silence. The newcomer strode straight to the counter, his broad frame passing close by Clara. His dirt-caked boots struck the floor in a steady, deliberate rhythm, each step declaring his presence. Ethan McCrae. The name needed no introduction. A young rancher, yet already bearing the hard lines of a man who had lost more than most. His wife, Anna, had died in childbirth, leaving him with an infant son. Since that day, Ethan had lived quietly at his ranch on the edge of Red Hollow, coming into town only when supplies ran low. Folks said he seldom smiled, spoke even less, but his eyes, no one ever dared dismiss them. Now those eyes fixed on the big man blocking Clara's path. The fellow, known for his jeering tongue, faltered the instant those dark brown pupils locked onto him. The smirk on his lips died away. The room grew heavy, filled only with the wind moaning against the eaves and the creak of the door hinges settling. "That's enough," Ethan said, his voice low and final. Just 3 words, yet they cracked like a whip, forcing the air to shift. "This woman has saved more lives than the lot of you put together." His hand rested lightly on the butt of his revolver, not hurried, not threatening, but enough to freeze every movement in the room. The man blocking Clara swallowed hard, his bravado shriveling. He stepped aside, awkward as a boy caught in the act. The shop held still. The women who had whispered before bent their heads, pretending to sort through herbs. The man by the fire lifted his mug of tonic, but his hand shook so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim. Ethan's gaze no longer lingered on them. He turned instead, laying several coins on the counter. His tone was calm, yet carried no room for refusal. For hers as well. Clara startled, shaking her head quickly. That isn't necessary. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. My boy is 2 years old. He's been coughing for days. I need your help. The breath of cold wind still clung to him, laced with the dust of the trail, brushing near her ear as he spoke. Clara stiffened, her hand still clutching the slip of paper. His eyes, though rimmed with weariness, shone with steady resolve. There was no pity there, only a direct, unflinching request. Before Clara could answer, a harsh laugh split the air. The same man from before, though cowed, reached for one last jab. He jutted his chin, his voice dripping with scorn. A woman who lost her own child, now tending to others. Who'd trust that? A midwife who couldn't even keep her own flesh and blood alive? The words sliced the room like a drawn blade, sharp, cold, leaving every breath suspended. They struck directly at the wound Clara had buried deepest. Her throat tightened. Murmurs rippled, then stilled, as though the whole shop waited for the fallout. Clara bowed her head, the paper in her hand trembling, her knuckles whitening. Images surged unbidden, the tiny infant who had never opened his eyes, the face of the husband lost to fever. Old grief, thought scarred over, was torn raw again in front of strangers. Ethan turned sharply. In an instant his gaze hardened, steel flashing in the firelight. His hand remained on his gun, but the step he took forward was enough to make the Watson recoil half a pace. Shut your mouth, Ethan said. His voice was cold, each word dropping heavy as a stone. The man started to speak, then swallowed his protest. Ethan did not need to draw his weapon. The silence of the room itself bore witness to his authority. The tension pressed so tight, even the snap of the fire in the hearth rang clear as gunfire. Clara did not lift her eyes, yet she felt it. A wall rising before her, a shield she had never known. For the first time in years of enduring such cruelty alone, someone stood in her defense. Not out of pity, but out of respect. The shopkeeper coughed into his hand, breaking the stillness. The medicine you asked for is ready. He slid a paper sack across the counter toward Clara. Ethan glanced at her, nodding once. Take it. No one dared interfere. The women who had whispered earlier drifted down another aisle, pretending sudden interest in dried teas, though their eyes now held less scorn and more unease. Clara reached for the sack, her hand still trembling. Ethan leaned slightly, speaking low enough for only her to hear. Come on. No reason to let another word touch you. The door swung open again, the winter wind rushing inside, scattering loose papers into the air. Ethan stepped out first, long strides solid and sure, his presence cutting a path through the weight of every watching gaze. Clara followed, her heart racing, caught between the urge to hurry and the strange warmth stirring within her, a mix of safety and unease. Behind them, as the door shut, whispers rose anew, but between Clara and their barbs now stood Ethan's broad back. Outside, the wind lashed colder than ever, yet Clara felt lighter. Not because the mockery had ended, it hadn't, but because, for the first time, it hadn't pierced her alone. Someone else had taken the blow. Ethan paused on the step, turning to face her. His eyes held no pity, no softness, only certainty. And that certainty was something Clara realized she had long hungered for. The road from Red Hollow to the McCrae Ranch stretched on, swallowed in a haze of white mist that hung low across the prairie like drifting smoke. The wagon wheels ground over the frozen earth, leaving glistening ruts in their wake. Clara sat beside Ethan, clutching the medicine satchel tight against her chest. The smell of horsehide, dry hay, and the biting cold seeping into her bones nearly made her forget the sting of the whispers back at the pharmacy. Yet each time her eyes slid toward the man beside her, she caught the rigid set of his shoulders, the far-off look in his eyes, as though beyond the fence lines lay a worry that could not be stilled. The land widened before them. Through the veil of mist, the outline of the McCrae Ranch came into view. A low wooden house with a weathered porch, 2 barns set on either side. It wasn't large, but bore the faint breath of a home once tended by a woman's hand. A row of wildflowers, now wilted, still clung beneath the windows. The carved frames around the shutters, plain yet thoughtful. But all of it carried the air of abandonment, left untouched since Anna's passing. When the wagon stopped, a ragged cough cracked from within the house. The door creaked open, and a small figure appeared. A boy, no more than 2 years old, hair a tangled mess of curls, his eyes red-rimmed from days of coughing. He crouched weakly on the threshold, tiny hands gripping the frame, breath wheezing. Clara's heart clenched at the sight. She hurried down from the wagon, striding toward the child. Samuel looked at the stranger through fever-fogged eyes, but before he could shrink back, his body swayed. Clara dropped to her knees, arms scooping him up, her cool hand pressing against his brow, burning hot. Her throat tightened. "Oh, little one." The whisper escaped before she could stop it. The boy did not answer, only surrendered to her hold. Yet in that instant, Samuel clung fiercely to her shoulder, his head sinking into the hollow of her neck, as though it were a refuge. Clara froze. The feel of a small, frail body pressed against hers was at once achingly familiar and unbearably strange, stirring the tears she had long forbidden herself. Behind her, Ethan's hand clenched unconsciously. In his eyes flickered a glimmer of gratitude, shadowed by helplessness. The helplessness of a father watching his child wrestle sickness with nothing to offer but worry and regret. Clara stepped across the threshold. The stale air of the house struck her at once. Damp ash, sour remnants of food. Silence, broken only by the whistle of wind through cracks in the wall. On the table, dishes stacked with scraps of hardened bread. The fireplace cold, its ashes gray, coal fragments scattered about. A man's coat slung hastily across a chair. Layers of dust settled thick. It was the house of a widower, surviving, but no longer caring for order. She set Samuel gently into a small armchair, then pulled a jar of herbs from Palma, her satchel. "We need hot water," she said firmly. Ethan moved at once, fumbling but swift, striking flint and feeding wood into the hearth. As the fire caught, Clara found a strip of cloth hanging forgotten in the kitchen, dipped it in cool water, and pressed it to the boy's fevered brow. Samuel whimpered, lashes trembling. Clara's hand moved softly along his back, a low murmur of a lullaby slipping from her lips, words she hadn't dared to sing in years. Ethan stood still, watching. The crackle of firewood filled the silence. He remembered the nights he had tried, with his rough voice and clumsy hands, to soothe the boy, only to have Samuel wail harder, coughing until he gasped. But now, here in the arms of this woman, the child's breathing, though strained, had found a steadier rhythm. "Thank you," Ethan murmured, barely above the fire's snap, as if afraid to break the fragile spell. Clara did not lift her gaze, only nodded faintly, her eyes fixed on the boy. That night, when Samuel at last drifted into a fitful sleep, Clara moved through the house with a lamp in hand. Its flame threw long shadows along the walls. In one corner of the bedroom stood a cradle, dust-covered, the pale blanket inside worn thin from years of use. Beside it lay a folded woolen shawl, clearly once Anna's. Clara brushed her fingers lightly across the fabric, as though touching a memory not her own, one that pierced as though it were. When she returned to the main room, she found Ethan sitting motionless before the fire, his face buried in his hands. The flames reflected in his weary eyes, fear etched deep. Clara said nothing. She only replaced the warm compress on Samuel's brow, then sank into the chair nearby. In that silence, she recognized something achingly familiar. A house bereft of a woman's care, a child frail and restless, a father stumbling through grief, her own past pressed down on her chest. But this time, instead of turning away, she stayed. Samuel stirred, his tiny hand reaching out, closing clumsily around Clara's finger. She startled, then gently curled her hand to hold his. In that fragile moment, the wind howled through the eaves, but within the walls of the house, a thin warmth stirred, like the first spark of a fire refusing to die. The fire in the hearth had caught steady, casting a soft amber glow across the cracked wooden beams. Samuel slept fitfully, his breathing still ragged, but the flush on his cheeks had begun to ease. Clara sat close by, her hand gently smoothing the boy's curls, her heart taut as a drawn string. Each time Samuel coughed, she flinched, quickly pressing a damp cloth against his brow. And as she worked, her eyes wandered the room, searching for something to hold her calm. On the table against the wall, scattered among the clutter of a man's life, a worn hunting knife, a rolled piece of horsehide, a few notebooks left unfinished. Something caught the firelight. A silver bracelet. The chain was thin but sturdy, the face carefully engraved with a single name, Anna. Clara's heart jolted, her breath stuttered, her eyes widened, then dropped, but too late to hold back the flood of memory. That silver band was not merely the keepsake of Ethan's late wife. It was a mirror of the life Clara herself had once lived. Her own husband, the gentle man who had dreamed of a small home with her, had once bought a bracelet almost identical, meant to be given after the birth of their child. But that day had never come. Fever had stolen the newborn within weeks, and soon after had taken him as well. Two graves on a hillside became the beginning of Clara's years under the name everyone whispered, the barren midwife. The gleam of the bracelet cut into her like a blade twisting in an old wound. Her chest constricted, her hands gripping her knees to hide the tremor. She would not let Ethan see her break. Too many times, her fragility had been laid bare before others, only to earn scorn. She turned her face away, fixing her eyes on Samuel, forcing her breath steady. But eyes tell truths, mouths refuse. When she looked up again, her gaze flicked once more to the silver band, an expression of recognition and pain so deep it betrayed her. Ethan, crouched by the fire to stir the flames, saw it. He blinked, taken aback. In her eyes he glimpsed something hauntingly familiar, an echo of his own nights in the weeks after Anna's death. Grief without words, carved deep enough to change a face forever. Her eyes shimmered, then quickly shuttered with a blink. But he had seen. He did not ask. He did not speak. Yet the question pressed in his mind. How could a stranger look upon Anna's bracelet with such rawness? Why did her gaze carry the same weight as his own when he had first lost his wife? Anguish so heavy it filled the very air. Clara remained by Samuel, her hands clasped around the boy's small fingers. She told herself sternly, "Don't let it show. Don't let the past drag you down." But her trembling hands betrayed her resolve. Ethan stood silent, watching. In the shifting glow of the flames, he saw not just the woman scorned as the midwife with no child, but a soul marked by loss, carrying a hidden wound as deep as his own. He remembered the taunts at the pharmacy, the way she had bowed her head at the mention of her child. And now, the missing piece fit. That sorrow was not gone. It shadowed her even now. The moment stretched. The silence between them felt like the only barrier keeping them from stepping closer. Clara changed the cloth on Samuel's forehead with brisk movements, her eyes carefully turned from the bracelet. She knew one more glance and the tears would betray her. Outside, the wind howled against the fence posts, and the cry of an owl carried through the night. Inside, the fire painted their faces from across the room. Two figures sitting apart, yet held by the same memory. Ethan clenched his fists, started to speak, then stopped. He knew. Some griefs are not meant to be touched with words, but with silence shared. At last, Clara rose, using the excuse of dishes to escape his gaze. She gathered the dirty bowls and carried them into the kitchen. The water was icy, biting at her hands, but it disguised the pounding of her heart. When she returned, Ethan had already taken the bracelet, slipped it into a small wooden box, and set it into a drawer. The gesture was both to guard Anna's memory and to shield Clara from its sting. She paused, surprised, but asked nothing. For a brief second, their eyes met, silent, but heavy with meaning. Samuel stirred, mumbling softly, then clutched at Clara's sleeve when she sat again. Ethan drew a long breath, his shoulders easing as he watched. In Clara's presence, something had shifted. The house did not feel quite so hollow. Clara bent down and pressed a light kiss to the boy's fevered brow. The act was for him, but also for herself, a fragile tether between her wounded past and the fragile present. Her heart still bled, but for the first time in years, it beat anew, stirred by the child in her arms. That night, Ethan did not sleep. He sat in his chair by the hearth, eyes half closed, ears alert to Samuel's coughs and Clara's quiet steps in the kitchen. Each flare of the fire carried him back to the moment her eyes had lingered on the bracelet, a wound too familiar to mistake. Clara did not sleep either. She sat with Samuel's hand in hers, thoughts drifting to her husband and the child she had lost. The ache had never left. Only now, in this man's house, it had found its reflection. Two sorrows, separate yet touching. When the rooster crowed at dawn, Clara finally let her eyes close for a moment. She did not know that across the room, Ethan still watched her in the soft light of morning. For the first time since Anna's death, feeling that the emptiness in his home had eased, if only a little. That night, the wind swept in from the prairie, threading through every crack in the wooden house. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only a bed of glowing embers, their faint light spilling across Clara's face as she sat beside Samuel's bed. The boy shifted restlessly, his breath still heavy, though less ragged than before. Clara sang softly, her lullaby thin as a thread, breaking against the vast silence of a house long empty of a child's laughter. Outside, the sky was washed in the color of ash. The late moon slipped between ragged clouds, casting fractured patches of light and shadow over the ground. Ethan, having stepped out to the barn to finish clearing the feed trough, froze when he caught another sound. Not wind, not cattle shifting, the tread of boots on frozen earth, measured, careful, but too deliberate to escape ears seasoned by the frontier. He stilled, sliding off his gloves, resting them on the doorframe. His hand drifted down to the butt of his revolver, instinct etched from years of fending off rustlers and wolves. From the far edge of the yard, 4 figures slid into view, drifting beneath the pallid moonlight. They moved in silence, fanning out as though to encircle. At their head strode a broad-shouldered man, unhurried, without fear. A scar cut down his face from temple to jaw, a mark as recognizable as his name, Briggs. In Red Hollow, that name carried weight. A drifter who lived by threats, by hired muscle, by road ambushes. He had seen the inside of a cell, but law in these parts was thin as paper. Now here he stood at Ethan's gate, lips curved in a half-smile, teeth stained yellow from cheap tobacco. "Cold night," Briggs called, voice gravelly, pitched to carry. Cold enough a man might seek warmth in conversation. Ethan gave no reply. He stepped clear of the barn's shadow, standing square beneath the moon, his face set in stone. Briggs jerked his chin toward the dim light inside the house. "No one in town wants a barren woman holed up here, McCrae. Keep her, and you'll wake one day to find this place in ashes." Inside, Clara sat bolt upright at the sound of that voice. Her hand gripped Samuel's blanket tight, her heartbeat racing. She knew that name, had heard it whispered in the market. But now, with the crunch of boots and the tang of gunpowder carried on the wind, she realized danger was no longer rumor. It was standing at the door. Ethan's voice came steady, low. "Briggs, out wandering this late, aren't you afraid of wolves?" Briggs chuckled, the sound dry as gravel. "Wolves? They only bite the weak. I'm not here to jest, McCrae. Just a reminder. Keep that woman, and trouble will follow close behind." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the revolver's grip. The air tensed, thick enough that Briggs's men halted, watching, waiting on his cue. The night fell still, broken only by the rustle of dry grass in the wind. Ethan stepped forward, far enough that the moon lit his eyes. "Trouble's mine to handle, but one more step, and I'll take this as more than talk." His hand had not drawn, but it didn't need to. The look alone, deep, cold, unyielding, was enough to halt Briggs mid-stride. In that gaze he saw the truth. A man who had lost everything feared no more loss. The silence dragged. No one dared break it. At last Briggs snorted, a short, bitter laugh, and with a jerk of his head, signaled retreat. "Cold night indeed. Let's go." The 4 shadows receded into the dark, vanishing beyond the fence, the stench of smoke and tobacco hanging in their wake. Ethan held his ground until the last bootstep faded. Only then did he ease his grip on the gun, drawing a long breath to steady the fury still burning in his chest. Inside, Clara pressed her ear against Samuel's chest, listening to the child's shallow rhythm, her hands trembling. When she glimpsed Ethan's shadow returning through the window, she turned away quickly, unwilling to let him see fear written plain on her face. Yet even without looking, she could hear the weight of his boots across the floorboards and feel the fierce resolve he had carried into the night on her behalf. Ethan shut the door behind him, glancing once more into the darkness before turning back toward the boy. He spoke nothing of Briggs. He only pulled his coat free and laid it across Samuel's small body, then sank into a chair by the window, keeping watch. Clara sat unmoving, her thoughts knotted tight. The jeering words still rang in her ears, stirring memories of the men who had once brought ruin to her family. Yet when she turned her gaze to Ethan, saw his frame cut against the silver moonlight, she felt the press of fear ease. For the first time in years, she realized she was not standing alone before the dark. Morning on the prairie usually began with the scent of dew-soaked grass and the distant cackle of hens. But this day, Clara felt no peace. Stepping onto the porch, her eyes froze at once. Hung upside down on the ranch gate was a ragged cloth doll, its head swaying in the breeze, its stitched arms fraying as though ready to tear loose. The face was smeared with soot, drawn into a crooked, mocking smile. For a moment, Clara could not breathe. Her heart felt gripped by an invisible hand. Memories she had long locked in the darkest corner shattered open. The image of her infant torn from her arms, the piercing wail that had once split her soul, and the memory of traffickers who had left a doll just like this hanging by a door, as a warning of what they wanted. She knew at once. Someone was digging at the deepest wound of her life. She trembled, fingers clutching the edge of her shawl to mask her weakness. Cold sweat seeped through the thin fabric, though the morning air still carried a chill. Behind her, Samuel dozed in his crib, blissfully unaware of the shadow circling the house. Clara swore she would not let him see it. This hanging specter, this promise of violence. Ethan stepped out just after her. The moment his eyes met the doll, his face darkened. No hesitation, no questions. He strode to the gate, yanked the rope hard, and the doll fell to the dirt with a puff of dust. Clara held her breath, waiting for anger, for curses, for some demand to explain. Instead, Ethan bent, pinched the doll between two fingers as though it were refuse, and carried it inside. He set it into the hearth, struck a flame, and fed it to the fire. The flames surged, hungrily devouring the old cloth until the soot-streaked face curled to ash. "This place doesn't host cowards' games," Ethan said simply, his tone flat, as though it were any other chore. Yet his eyes flicked toward Clara, and in that instant, he seemed to notice something more. Her gaze on the doll had not been surprise. It was the gaze of someone who had seen it before, endured it, bled under it. Clara quickly bent, gathering kindling at the hearth to hide the tremor at her lips. But she knew Ethan was not easily fooled. Since the day before, he had seen her peculiar fear of things others would shrug at, and now his eyes pressed into her, as though waiting for her to choose, silence or confession. The small cabin fell quiet, the only sound the fire snapping as it consumed the doll. Samuel stirred in his crib, cooing softly, breaking the tension a little. Yet Clara still felt herself dragged backward in time, to the night cruelty had gutted her life. The doll was no prank. It was a knife turning old scars raw. Ethan lowered himself into a chair, elbows braced on his knees, eyes fixed on the fire. His posture was calm, but his shoulders coiled like a man ready for any strike. At last he spoke, voice low and steady. "Whoever did this, wasn't aiming at me. Clara bit her lip, the words sliced through her armor. He was right. This wasn't meant for Ethan. It was for her, the barren midwife, the woman who had lost her child, the one the world had already tried to break. She wanted to cry out, to tell him everything, that a doll was never harmless, that it was the sign of men who did worse than threaten. But her throat closed. For years, silence had been her survival, her only way to protect what little soul she had left. Speaking meant tearing the wound wide open, and she doubted she could bear it. Ethan pressed no further. He only watched, as though he understood that some truths cannot be pried, only waited on. Still, in his eyes burned a strange resolve, the vow not only to shield Samuel, but Clara as well, whether she asked it or not. The day crawled on. Clara worked as she always did, cooking, cleaning, teaching Samuel to scratch crooked letters on scraps of paper. But each time her eyes strayed toward the gate, the doll reappeared, swaying in her mind, a question she could not quiet. Was her past truly buried, or was it reaching for her again? By afternoon, the wind rose, rippling the prairie into a sea of gold. Ethan rode out, saying only that he meant to check the horses. But Clara knew he had gone further, following tracks, hunting for whoever dared trespass. Briggs and his men were the obvious culprits. Yet deep in her chest, Clara felt something colder. Familiar hands from long ago reaching back to reclaim what they once tried to take. When Ethan returned, the sun had darkened his face, but his eyes were sharper still. He laid his revolver on the table, wiped the dust from its barrel, and said quietly, "They want us afraid. I won't allow it." Clara nodded faintly, though her heart surged with unrest. Ethan was strong. She knew he had faced danger before. But she? Could her torn heart withstand another clash, when this time the enemy wasn't just threatening, but dragging her old demons into the light? Night came. The fire burned down, leaving only ashes mixed with scraps of the doll. Clara sat on the porch, staring at the moonlit fields turned silver. Inside her, the question pulsed. Was this fate's test, or was it her past, refusing to let go? Behind her, Ethan shut the door and stepped out, standing beside her. Neither spoke, yet the silence was a balm, one that made it easier to breathe. For in that quiet, Clara knew she was no longer alone before the ghost that had hung on the gate. By late afternoon, the wind swept down from the mountains into the valley, carrying a chill sharp as winter's return. Inside the cabin, laughter had long been absent. Only the ragged breaths of Samuel filled the air, thick and heavy. The little boy lay on the bed, cheeks burning red, sweat running in streams down his temples. Each faint moan was a knife driven into the hearts of the two adults keeping vigil. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, his calloused hands trembling, clenching together without purpose. He turned to Clara, his voice hoarse, weighted with fear and helplessness. "I lost my wife in childbirth. I can't lose my boy. Not him too." Clara set her hand on his shoulder, firm and steady, pouring her certainty through her touch. Her face was taut but resolute. "No, tonight this child will live. I promise." The promise was not only for him, it was for herself. Behind her eyes, another fever rose, the memory of the baby she had once lost in a poor, dim room years ago. She had sat powerless as each breath grew thinner until silence fell. That death had torn her life apart, left a wound that never healed. And now, as Samuel burned with fever, the fear surged back, suffocating her. But this time she would not let it win. Clara moved quickly, kindling the fire once more, setting a pot of water to boil, dropping in leaves from her stores. Steam rose, pungent and bitter, filling the air with a moist warmth. She soaked a cloth, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against Samuel's brow, each motion patient, precise. Ethan watched, realizing with a pang that in all his fumbling, he had never tended his son like this. Since Anna's death, he had avoided such closeness, as though fearing that to love too openly was to invite loss again. The lamplight flickered, casting Clara's shadow long against the timbered wall. Her brown hair hung loose in disarray, her shirt damp with sweat, but her hands never ceased their work. Ethan felt a rush within him, gratitude, respect, and something deeper he dared not name. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks, carrying the distant cry of wolves. The small cabin stood like a fragile fort against a world that seemed bent on breaking it. Ethan rose suddenly, pulling another heavy blanket over his son, then fed more wood to the fire. It was little, but it was all he could do to keep from going mad with stillness. Midnight came, and the fever still raged. Samuel muttered incoherently in delirium, chest rising and falling too fast. Clara held his tiny hand tight, whispering his name over and over. In that moment, she felt the clash of two griefs, one long past, one threatening now. Tears welled, but she brushed them away before Ethan could see. Suddenly, Samuel gasped, his chest heaving violently. Ethan lunged, scooping the boy into his arms, panic in his eyes. "Clara, he can't breathe!" Clara pressed her palm to the child's chest, feeling the frantic rise and fall. She grabbed a vial of wild honey, diluted it with warm water, and spooned it carefully between Samuel's cracked lips. The liquid slid down, easing his throat. Then she pressed a hot poultice of herbs to his chest, applying gentle pressure in rhythm. Gradually, the wheeze softened. The little chest loosened, breaths finding steadier ground. The moment stretched like eternity. Ethan held his breath until the sound of his son's easier breathing filled the room. He collapsed into a chair, pale, yet his eyes burned with relief. Clara never let go of the boy's hand, gripping it as if he might vanish should she release him. The night dragged on in tension. Near dawn, Samuel's sweat broke in a flood. Clara allowed herself the faintest smile, whispering, "The fever has broken." Ethan's eyes, bloodshot and raw, turned to her. His voice cracked, thick with gratitude. "Thank you. Without you, I—" He didn't finish, but Clara understood. She gave a quiet nod, her gaze fixed on the child now sleeping in peace, and when the pale light of dawn seeped through the cracks, Samuel slept sound, his forehead cool. Clara exhaled, exhaustion pressing down on her body until she nearly collapsed. Ethan reached out, steadying her, guiding her to a chair. For the first time since they had met, the invisible distance between them thinned. In silence they sat side by side, listening to the boy's even breaths. Ethan whispered, his voice low as prayer. "I've lost too much. But tonight, I think maybe God sent you here." Clara turned to him, but did not speak. In her eyes, something softened, fragile, hesitant, like a glimmer of light across thawing snow. Outside, the call of prairie roosters announced the day. Sparrows darted and chattered along the eaves, as if no shadow had ever lingered near the wooden house. Yet both knew the threat had not vanished. Briggs and his men were still out there, waiting like ghosts. Clara adjusted Samuel's blanket, then rose. She went to the hearth, pulled a small piece of cloth from a box, a scrap embroidered with the name of the child she had lost. She slipped it into her pocket, a reminder. Last night, she had saved a life, but it meant her enemies would not relent. Ethan watched in silence, understanding that Clara carried secrets she was not yet ready to bear. But he also knew this. In the night, when two broken hearts had fought side by side to keep a child alive, a new bond had been forged. When the sun crested the ridgeline, warm gold spilled into the room, chasing the cold away. Samuel stirred, his lips curling in a faint, dreaming smile. Clara and Ethan's eyes met, wearied, but holding something else as well. A fragile hope, a quiet faith that from this day forward, life might be different. The oil lamp flickered, casting Clara's shadow long against the wooden wall. All through the night she sat by Samuel's bed, her hands tirelessly changing damp cloths and pressing them against his burning forehead. His skin was ablaze, sweat soaking the sheets, but she did not relent. Each time the boy whimpered, her heart tightened as though a fist clenched around it. Ethan sat slumped in the chair opposite, his back bent, hands knotted so tight his knuckles whitened. His eyes were hollow, drained. Whether from fear or from old memories consuming him, Clara could not tell. He had once watched his wife die in childbirth, and now his son's fever pressed him against that same cliff's edge once more. Clara knew. She saw his hands tremble as he poured water, saw his shoulders lock whenever Samuel's breath hitched. But instead of panic, she chose silence, tending to the boy with the patient steadiness only those who had lived through loss could muster. She heated water, added sprigs of mint and a touch of sweetgrass Maria from town had once shown her. The scent drifted through the room, sharp yet calming, pushing back the oppressive heat of fever. Clara hummed, not a lullaby, but fragments of melody, wordless as wind through trees. Her voice faltered now and then, but she kept on. Ethan's voice broke the silence, hoarse as if torn by thorns. When Samuel was smaller, I'd carry him out to the pasture. I'd tell him about the calves, about the spring creek, about the wide sky he'd grow up under. He didn't understand, but he'd laugh. I thought, if he could hear now, maybe he'd remember. Clara lifted her head. In his eyes flickered something both warm and desperate, like a fire struggling against the wind. Then tell him, she said firmly. He will hear. And so Ethan began. He spoke of the calves learning to run, legs wobbling across the sunlit prairie. He told of the creek at its source, clear enough to see the stones beneath. He described the first spring after the blizzard broke, when the fields came alive in a green so fierce it hurt the eyes. Samuel lay still, his breaths uneven, but his lashes flickered faintly at the sound of his father's voice. Clara kept changing cloths, her hands as gentle as if too firm a touch might shatter the fragile life beneath them. Every story Ethan told was like a rope thrown into the dark, anchoring the boy, refusing to let him slip away. Outside, the night wind combed through the pines, whispering low. Clara shivered. The memory of the doll hanging on the gate clawed back, but she forced it aside. Not tonight. Tonight the boy had to live. Time seemed to freeze. They were bound inside a small circle, the oil lamp, the scent of herbs, the sound of storytelling, and the jagged rhythm of a child's breathing. Clara lost count of how many cloths she changed, how many tales Ethan spun. She only knew that when the faint wings of dawn began to press against the window, Samuel's body eased. The heat on his brow had broken. His breathing grew steadier. Clara sagged, tears rushing to her eyes, but she wiped them quickly before Ethan could see. Then, in the hush, Samuel stirred. His dry lips parted, moving faintly. At first, Clara thought it was only another rasp of breath, but Ethan heard it clear. "Mama!" It was barely a whisper, softer than the prairie wind, yet it shook the room to its core. Clara froze, every muscle gone rigid. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes darkening, then shifting to something else, something quieter, deeper. His gaze locked on Clara, piercing through the walls she had built around herself. Clara swallowed hard, ready to insist it was only fever dream rambling. But her throat seized. She knew what the boy had called out for, the gentling touch of a mother, the arms to rock him, the presence he had been denied since his first breath. Ethan said nothing, no sudden words, no hurried gestures, only his eyes, heavy as the whole sky, fixed upon her. In them lay gratitude, confusion, and a fear he hadn't dared name. The fear that his heart was being drawn somewhere he could no longer control. Clara bent low, pressing a soft kiss to Samuel's brow. She whispered, though the words were for herself as much as for him. "Sleep now, little one. Sleep in peace." Ethan rose, crossing to the window. He cracked it open, letting the cool dawn air wash into the room. The breeze loosened the knots in his shoulders, yet within him the storm raged on. He knew he should speak, but every word caught in his throat. Clara quietly gathered the pile of damp cloths. She moved as though untouched, yet her hands trembled slightly. Inside her, emotions clashed, relief at the boy's survival, pain at the word that cut to her core, and a fragile tether pulling her closer to Ethan than she had ever allowed herself to drift. When Samuel finally slipped into deep sleep, Clara stepped outside, onto the porch. Dawn spread gold over the prairie, shafts of light piercing the thinning mist. She drew a long breath. How long had it been since she had felt the scent of morning? Since her heart had beat not from fear, but from something softer, stranger. Ethan followed, standing beside her. They did not touch, but the distance between them seemed less than ever. "He's safe now," Clara said, her voice low but sure. Ethan nodded. "Because of you." Clara shook her head gently. "Because of him. He wanted to live." Her words made Ethan lift his gaze to the sky, where the first sunray split the gray clouds. He stayed silent, then turned. His eyes no longer held only gratitude. There was something fiercer, deeper, but he held it back. Clara met that gaze, her chest tightening. She turned away, stepping down from the porch, letting the wind take her. She knew that from the moment Samuel had called her Mama, everything had shifted. Not only for the boy, but for both of them, fumbling toward the meaning of home. Inside the cabin, Samuel's steady breath lingered like a fragile promise. Life had triumphed this night. Yet outside, the threat had not vanished. Clara felt it, sharp as ever. The hands that had hung that doll on the gate would not stop. They were waiting, lurking. And this fragile piece, light as morning mist, could vanish in an instant. Ethan knew it. Clara knew it. But they did not speak. They only stood side by side, letting silence bear their unspoken vow. Whatever came, they would face it together. News in the West never traveled slow. A whisper in the saloon one evening became rumor at the market by dawn, each telling twisting it sharper than the last. The name of Rancher McCrae was now bound to the poisonous phrase, the barren midwife, a barb aimed square at Clara. Folks said he had brought a childless woman into his home, sheltering her as though she were wife in all but name. For a widower who had lived quiet and earned respect, such talk was no different from a gale stoking embers already smoldering. In Dust Hollow, reputation weighed heavier than law. One look, one misplaced smile could stain a name beyond washing. Clara knew it well. She went to market less, slipping out only in the off hours, scarf pulled low across her face. Yet stares pierced through the cloth. Some snickered, some spoke loud enough for her to hear. Widow barely buried her man, now clinging to McCrae's house. Just a throwaway line, but enough to choke her for an entire day. Ethan McCrae was not a man to trouble over idle tongues. Yet he knew such words, sooner or later, would be forged into weapons by enemies. And so it came to pass. One late afternoon, a procession of carriages rolled up to his gate. The Whitmores, the bank owners, the land barons, the wealthiest clan in the county, had come without warning. Out stepped Mr. Whitmore, heavy set in a black coat, his face void of smiles, bearing the gravity of a man long used to command. Behind him came his daughter, Amelia Whitmore, the so-called flower of the town. Her cheeks were rosy, her gown a sheen of silk, and her eyes glinted with pride. Whispers had long circled that Amelia would be Mrs. McCrae. Such a union would marry wealth to respect, binding two names into one unshakable pillar. There was no preamble. Whitmore thrust out his hand, voice ironclad. "Marry my daughter, and you'll preserve the name of McCrae. Don't let this place turn to laughter any longer." The words cut like a blade across Clara, though her name was never spoken. She stood on the porch, hands frozen over the washboard. Soap suds dripped through trembling fingers. She had lived with scorn all her life, but to hear it laid bare by a man of such power, in broad daylight, on this very ground, it branded shame into her bones. Ethan's hand tightened at his belt, eyes locked on Whitmore. In that instant, Clara saw his back as a wall, a shield barring the world from striking her. Yet silence pressed in, so thick one could hear the wind slicing through the pines. Amelia stepped forward, smiling sweetly. "You know, Ethan, we suit each other. My father only seeks what's best for both families. And those rumors, one wedding, and they'll vanish." Clara turned her face, hiding the tear that had broken free. She understood. On this scale she was nothing, a shadow without name, a woman whose womb had betrayed her. How could she stand against the weight of a family's designs? But Ethan gave no answer to the proposal. Instead, he turned to Clara. For one fleeting heartbeat, their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw no wavering, but something quieter, older, a rooted strength that no storm could bend. Whitmore's brow furrowed. "You don't want to set yourself against my family, Ethan. In these parts, banks carry more power than guns. Marry my daughter, or watch the McCrae name spat on." The threat hung heavy. From the fields beyond came the caw of crows, punctuating the weight of it. Clara bit her lip, hand clutching the doorframe, body frozen. She longed for Ethan to choose peace, to let her slip away quietly, carrying what little dignity she had left. But then Ethan lifted his chin. My name needs no gift from another, and this house, Tomes, has not been empty for some time. Just a single line, yet it shattered every Whitmore design. The banker's face flushed red, Amelia's paled white. The silence that followed bore more weight than any gunshot. Clara's heart thundered. To the town, those words would become fuel for sharper gossip. But to her, they were a lifeline, pulling her from the pit, proof that at least one soul did not count her a burden. The carriages rolled away in clouds of dust. Even as they vanished, Clara stood rooted on the porch. Ethan stepped close, stopping just before her. He said nothing more, only pressed his calloused palm against the doorframe, beside her smaller hand. They did not meet each other's eyes, but the silence between them burned warmer than comfort ever could. Yet Clara knew the storm was far from over. Word of this visit would blaze through town like fire through dry grass. Folks would say Ethan McCrae defied the mighty Whitmores for the sake of a barren widow. Such words could break reputations, turn friends to strangers, and tighten the bank's noose on his land. That night, with Samuel sleeping sound, Clara sat alone by the hearth. Firelight etched lines of worry deep across her face. She knew herself to be the root of this trouble, and the question gnawed at her. Was her presence a weight that would bring this house down? Outside, dogs barked into the night. The wind carried the faint reek of smoke from town, a herald of whispers already spreading. Clara clutched her shawl tight, one question burning in her chest. Did she have the courage to stay, when the whole world beyond these walls seemed bent on driving her away from the only place she had begun to call home? Ethan met Whitmore's eyes, his voice striking through the cabin like a gavel in judgment. She is my family. The words, plain as they were, fell like a cleaver, splitting the already heavy air. Clara froze, her hands trembling faintly. Not from fear, but because for the first time, someone's words had given her something to hold to, a back to stand behind. In that instant, she felt both small and seen. The Whitmores stiffened, especially the old banker, a man used to bowing others. His lips pressed thin, eyes sharp as a knife's edge. Young McCrae, you're dazzled by sentiment. But this land, this reputation, it is not yours to gamble with. A barren woman, a woman marked by disgrace, will drag you down to ruin. Clara bowed her head. Each word struck like a blade, reopening wounds carved by years of whispers. But this time, she was not alone. Ethan stood before her, his hand resting firm on her shoulder, steady as an oak rooted deep in wild ground. Reputation, Ethan said slowly, was never yours to give me, and it will not be yours to take. I'll marry her, not by force but by choice. Silence fell, broken only by the wind rattling the chinks in the walls. The Whitmores departed, leaving behind a stench like ash after a fire. Clara remained motionless until Ethan's hand tightened on her shoulder, guiding her to look at him. In his eyes there was no pity, only a certainty so fierce it was almost pride. But as the hoofbeats faded, a flash split Clara's mind like lightning cleaving the night. The face of Briggs, the brute who had skulked around town, who had muttered threats cloaked in jest, rose before her. And when the fragments came together, the revelation struck cold. It had been the Whitmores who hired Briggs to frighten her, to drive her from the ranch, and bend Ethan toward their daughter. The truth made Clara shudder, not from fear, but from the sudden door it kicked open. Briggs. That name was not new. It had brushed her life years before, in the darkest hour. The night her infant was lost, or rather, stolen, the same network of traffickers bore his mark. The squalid room, the stifled cries, the door that slammed and never opened again, all bore his shadow. That memory, buried deep, now roared back alive, twined with the present. Past and present closed upon her like two shears at her heart. Clara broke. For the first time before Ethan, her proud wall crumbled. Tears streaked down her cheeks, not just for today's shame, but for all the losses sealed and buried. Ethan asked no questions. He simply clasped her hand, calloused but warm, lending her the strength slipping from her grip. "Clara," he said softly, "we've survived worse than them. Those men can't shape your life. They can't shape mine. I choose you." The words anchored her in the current, threatening to pull her under. Clara raised her gaze to his, seeing in those eyes no shadow of doubt, only depth unshaken. And she knew, this time, she would not fight alone. Outside, rain broke over the land, pounding the cabin roof, washing away the wheel tracks left by the Whitmore carriage, as though heaven itself sought to bury their deceit. That night, Clara tossed sleepless, haunted by Briggs. The memories returned. The stench of damp wood, the heavy boots, the infant's last breath. Now to know the man tied to that terror had returned, and that he conspired with the powerful to break her once more. It was almost too much to bear. But unlike then, she was no longer empty-handed. She had Ethan. She had Samuel. And she had a reason never to yield again. No child, and not herself, would be left a victim under Briggs's shadow. By dawn, Ethan was out tending the stock. Clara sat in the kitchen, eyes dark with weariness, but sharper now, burning with resolve. She began writing, piecing memories into a map of Briggs, the Whitmore tie, the network that once crushed her life. When Ethan returned, he found her bent over scrawled pages. He didn't ask, only poured her a cup of warm water. Clara lifted her face, offering a faint, wry smile. "They think I can only weep, but I'll show them what a woman who's lost everything can become." Ethan studied her a long moment, then nodded. He knew that something in her had shifted, no longer only the sufferer, but one stepping into the fight. By dusk, gossip churned again through the town. Some said Whitmore would not forgive the insult. Others muttered McCrae had doomed himself. Yet inside the wooden house, two souls had sealed a silent vow. They would not back down. That night Samuel slept soundly, his cheeks rosy, his breath steady. Clara sat beside him, smoothing his soft hair. In his sleep the boy whispered again, the word etched into both their hearts. "Mama," Ethan heard. Standing in the doorway, his eyes fell on Clara. He spoke no word, but his silence bore more promise than any oath. Outside, the rain ceased. A pale new moon climbed from the clouds, spilling silver across the small cabin. Storms still lay ahead, but one truth had already set root in that humble ground. They were no longer strangers thrown together by chance. They were a family, bound by choice, by defiance, and by love no power could decree or take away. Autumn winds swept across Dust Hollow's square, carrying the scents of roasted corn, stewed apples, and wood smoke from hastily built stalls. Folks pressed shoulder to shoulder, half watching a calf roping contest, half swaying to the lively fiddle music. But when Ethan McCrae stepped onto the wooden platform at the square's center, time itself seemed to slow. In his hand was a worn silver ring, dulled by years but still gleaming with quiet pride. It had belonged to his mother, a woman who had survived more droughts and winters than most men, and still kept the hearth burning for her family. Ethan clenched it as though holding the weight of his lineage. His voice rang steady, iron beneath the softness. This woman has turned my empty house into a home. Clara Wynne, will you stay with me? A ripple ran through the crowd. Wives tugged at husbands' sleeves and whispered. Old ranch hands nodded gravely. Children giggled, wide-eyed, never having seen such a public proposal. In the center of that ring of eyes, Clara stood still. Her dark blue dress caught the late sun like scattered stars, her hands trembling at her sides. The whispers that had haunted her for months echoed in her chest. A midwife without a child. A shadow that brings misfortune. McCrae only keeps her to stave off his loneliness. Each word had been a needle, and yet now, Ethan, a man as steady as the land itself, was staking his family's honor before the whole town, only to claim her as his choice. Clara lifted her gaze. Her eyes met his, calm and steadfast as oak. She nodded. A cheer burst through the square. The fiddler struck up a brighter tune, strings ringing sharp and jubilant. Palms clapped like thunder. Children ran circles, hollering. Elders bobbed their heads, remembering weddings past. Ethan stepped down from the platform and strode to Clara. Dropping to one knee, he raised her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It was a little loose, but the silver shone like a star reborn, and Clara felt as though she wore not just a ring, but the weight and the strength of his family's history. Not because they pressed me, Ethan murmured, only for her to hear. Because I choose you. Clara's vision blurred with tears. For years, she had believed herself a woman defined only by loss, by a child taken, by whispers that called her barren, by the cruel half-glances of society. But now, beneath the golden fall light and the town's applause, she realized perhaps fate had left her a fragment of warmth after all. That night, the autumn fair burned bright with lanterns. Torches lit the stalls. Hawkers shouted over the smell of hot corn cakes. Ethan and Clara walked side by side, speaking little. Sometimes his hand shielded her from a jostling elbow. Sometimes he passed her a cup of hot cider. You know, Clara whispered, I once thought I'd live my life in the shadow of others. Now, Ethan said, his eyes on the torchlight, flickering in hers. You're standing in the light. An old ribbon seller pressed a length of red string into Clara's palm, chuckling toothlessly. Take it, dear. In Dust Hollow, what's tied with red ribbon can't be undone. Clara laughed softly, wrapping it round her wrist, her heart lightened by the small blessing. But not every gaze was kind. From the far edge of the square, beneath a shadowed elm, Briggs watched. His coat was dark, his eyes narrowed at the scene. Once hired to frighten Clara, he now witnessed her claimed before the town, his face unreadable. A hand landed on his shoulder. Whitmore's loyal manservant. His voice was low and cold. The master will not let this pass. McCrae has shamed the family in public. And you, Briggs, you still owe us. Briggs's jaw tightened, a sly gleam flickering in his eyes. The fair ended with a circle dance around the bonfire. Ethan was no dancer, but he took Clara's hand all the same. His calloused palm engulfed her delicate fingers. Their steps were awkward, halting, but their eyes, fixed on each other, were unwavering. "Will you regret dragging me before the whole town?" Clara asked, half fearful of the answer. Ethan shook his head. "If I regret anything, it's only that I didn't do it sooner." In that moment, Clara felt 18 again, before the world had stolen her child, before grief had hardened her heart. She rested her head lightly on his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time in years, believed hers could find its rhythm again, too. News of the proposal spread across Dust Hollow overnight. By morning, when Clara walked into the market for flour, stall wives greeted her with rare warmth, tucking dried apples into her basket. Children pointed and shouted, "That's the midwife! She's gonna be Mrs. McCrae!" Yet whispers still cut the air. One man muttered, "We'll see if she brings him blessing or ruin." Another replied, "Didn't you see? He looks at her like she's good earth. That ain't pity." Clara heard them, but her heart did not seize this time. For when she returned to the ranch, Samuel came running to the gate, crying, "Mama," clear as day. And Ethan, hammer paused mid-swing at the horse pen, looked up with a gaze that held only certainty. That night in the cabin, Clara sewed by lamplight, the silver ring glowing faintly as her needle passed through cloth. Ethan came to her side, resting his rough hand on her shoulder. "Clara," he said gently, "we'll wed in the spring. When the snow melts, when the earth is new, when seeds take root. What do you say?" She lifted her eyes, smiling softly. "Spring is good. But Ethan, I have no dowry, no family name." He shook his head. "You've given me what gold and land never could, a home. That dowry no one in this town could buy." Her tears fell then, but they were light, unburdened. For once she was not defined by what had been taken, but by what she had been chosen for. At the edge of town, the Whitmores plotted in silence. A public wedding would mean open defiance of their power. Briggs was summoned. A new plan laid, a plan sharper, darker, more dangerous than gossip. And in the quiet cabin, Clara lay in Ethan's arms, unaware of the storm already gathering. The autumn wind whispered through the cracks, carrying the scent of smoke from town. Peace in the West was always fragile, but perhaps that was why it was worth guarding most. Samuel toddled forward, his tiny arms wrapping tight around Clara's leg, his clear eyes lifted as he called out one word, "Mama." The sound rang through the square like a church bell, silencing every whisper that had once clung to her name. For a heartbeat, the whole crowd stood still. Then the applause broke loose, rolling like waves across faces that had known only scorn. No one called her midwife with no children anymore. She stood now as a symbol of endurance, a mother, a wife, and most of all, the warm heart of the McCrae family. Ethan said nothing more. He only tightened his hand around hers. His quiet smile was unadorned, but within it lay a vow, whole and unbreakable, needing no words. Clara nodded faintly, her eyes red but shining, her glance speaking back. "I understand. And I choose you too." The fair carried on, fiddle music and laughter spinning around them. But to Clara, every sound grew distant. She bent to listen as Samuel chattered about a song he had practiced for the festival but had been too shy to sing. Clara whispered back that to her, his small cry of "Mama" was sweeter than any melody ever written. Samuel grinned wide, his hand clutching hers, as if he feared letting go would mean losing her forever. A few women from town approached. among them some who had once been the sharpest tongues, the cruelest whisperers. An old woman, bent and wheezing, fixed her gaze on Clara. "Child, forgive us. Perhaps we were wrong to judge you by nothing but gossip." Clara's voice was soft but steady. "Out here, every soul carries scars. The only difference is whether we let them heal or keep them bleeding." The old woman nodded, her eyes welling. Even Whitmore himself, who had once cut her down with words cold as steel, came forth. His face sagged with heaviness, his lips trembling. "McCrae, I was mistaken to think reputation weighs more than love. This girl, she may well be heaven's gift to you." Ethan gave no reply. He simply drew Clara beneath his arm, his gaze speaking a truth stronger than speech. That night, after lanterns dimmed and the square grew quiet, Ethan guided Clara back to the ranch. The once empty cabin glowed with firelight, the smell of fresh bread spilling from the kitchen. Samuel sat doodling clumsy shapes into a plank of wood, declaring it a family picture. In the crude lines were a tall man, a smiling woman, and a small child holding their hands. Clara pressed the little board to her chest, as if it were treasure. Ethan watched, silence in his eyes. For years, his life had been bound to the land, to cattle, to toil, never imagining he might hold a true home. Yet Clara, the woman scorned as incomplete, had filled the hollow in him with warmth. The days shifted. Dust Hollow no longer cast looks of suspicion upon Clara. Townsfolk sought her not just as a midwife, but as a source of quiet strength. One day, a young girl carrying the shame of an unborn child came to her, tears falling fast. Clara asked no questions. She poured warm water and whispered, "We'll find a way." Ethan, standing in the shadows, felt pride swell, for the woman he had chosen was not only saving him, but mending other lost souls too. Samuel grew into Ethan's shadow, tagging along to the fields, learning reins, knots, the feeding of cattle. But each night, before sleep, he nestled against Clara and whispered, "Mama, I'm scared you'll be gone when I wake." Clara stroked his hair, voice trembling. "No, my son. I'll be here until the day your fear fades." That night, for the first time, she prayed, not for herself, but for a child to grow up in the love she had once longed for. Winter came. Snow crowned the ranch white. In the kitchen, Clara hung 3 stockings by the fire, one for Samuel, one for Ethan, one for herself. When Samuel asked if Santa would find his way, Clara laughed softly, her eyes glistening. "Yes, so long as our hearth is burning." Ethan caught her glance and knew the words weren't just for the boy. They were a vow that their house would never again be empty. One afternoon, rummaging through the barn, Clara uncovered an old wooden cradle, worn and dusted, perhaps once belonging to Ethan's mother. Her hand trembled as she brushed away the years. For so long, the loss of her child had been an open wound. But now, seeing the cradle, she no longer felt cut, only promise that even emptiness could be filled. Ethan found her still and silent, and set his hand upon her shoulder. "One day, this cradle will hold new cries, but even if it doesn't, we are already enough." Clara turned, finding his eyes steady as bedrock. By the next spring, the McCrae Ranch had become a gathering place. People spoke of a family bound not by blood, but by choice. Samuel grew among love. Clara stood as a figure of resilience. Ethan, once a hardened rancher, learned to smile at the sight of a home lit bright against the dusk. At sunset, the prairie flamed gold. Clara sat on the porch with Samuel asleep on her lap. Ethan beside her, their hands twined. Clara whispered, "Perhaps we aren't born family. Perhaps we find each other and choose to be one." Ethan only smiled, his eyes following the sky where flocks flew home. In that silence, they both knew the past had nearly broken them, but their choice in the present had built something enduring, not built of reputation, not of gossip or wealth, only of presence, of devotion. And that was the West's rarest gift. The story closes, but its echo lingers, that love heals and family is not always born of blood, but of choice and of loyalty. Dear friends, if this tale stirs in you a memory of love, a home, or a second chance, share it below. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we may carry more Wild West love stories together. Through each small tale, each smile, each tear,